Okay, well, maybe we should start and to look into monitoring and evaluation. Maybe logistical announcements first. You got my email, all of you, saying that last class will be actually next class. And, one of the, my motivation for that is I know that so many of you are so stretched and stressed. So rather than just do a presentation for the sake of doing one, might as well put more effort into the actual content and paper itself. What's interesting though, I think some of your classmates like Christina, and we were just discussing before the class started, I think that there's a lot of interest in your projects. So maybe one of the things that we could do next class is just to have a 5-minute go around, for everyone just to talk a little bit about that project and what they've learned. If you have anything to demo, you can use the computer and stuff. Is that okay? Yeah, so I'll make an announcement for people who are not here.
Maybe can I just add real quick, because what I was suggesting was maybe a more informal way of just sharing our project, and maybe like afterwards, not saying this week, but I don't know if you guys are interested or around, like maybe meet for a drink after everyone's done to share, because then you have the stress over.
we should do that too. I think with the 5-minute idea is a good thing, just to kind of just hear what everybody has been up to. And then after that, we can do a drink, although I suspect a lot of us would be like back for, off to our next adventure. Yeah. So, okay, and then just try to come to class. Well, not try, please do come to class on Wednesday. I'll get some food, sandwiches and all that, so we could be a lunch kind of thing. Okay, so with that, let's do review of our last session, which was the implementation side of things. So you remember, so we spent last week on that. Last Monday we talked about the eChopal case where we mapped out the old information flow versus the new information flow to try to figure out what is some of the information issues and challenges that the project was trying to achieve. And then what we did was, we reviewed the case and talked about what made eChopal kind of a successful project, because it's sort of been touted as fairly, one of the more successful projects in a field of many projects that fail. And you can see that the best practices are not that different again, right, than what we have talked about throughout the course. And then we did implementation on user design, and the good people who did come to class, did some mock-ups of the web mobile app that was the exercise in the class. So this is sort of a quick crash course. Like I said, this user design in itself is a complete course in the iSchool. So then we moved on to the next part of implementation, which is aside from just mere project implementation, project per se, we looked at the complex environments within implementation. And we talked about the DAFO case, the stoves, and mapped out some of the difficult levels of decisions, and we did some role-playing to show that, oftentimes in practice, the real problem is not the technical side of things, but the other political and social side. So right now, as we move in our project life cycle, we will be doing monitoring and evaluation for this session. So because, one of my promises to you was to cut down on the readings, what I thought was, I could just do a quick brain dump. But bear in mind that in this day and time, M&E is sort of a big field right now, which is really weird, because when I started international development in 1995, barely anyone was talking about M&E. Most donors were very happy to just, give money. And if you think about how development actually started, it was really a lot of churches in the late, late 1800s. People were donating, and then they were donating to humanitarian causes. Nobody was asking them, wait, now that I've given you this money, show me how you spent it. What happened though is that as from the 1950s onwards, the number of players and the field in itself exploded, and it's become way more competitive. So in the late 1990s, there was a big question, and that continues today, to say, well, how do we know that our money is being put into good use, particularly as governments and donors face more and more pressures from their constituents. So therein, that's the reason why, M&E has sort of morphed into this like big field now, and that's something that it's a as a consultant, that's what they always. That's a big field that is always needed. Okay, so a quick brain down. So there are many different types of M&E that we talk about, right? The high level of community level, i.e. you're looking at societal impact. Can malaria be eradicated? Or can Singapore become developed? Then there's an organizational level, which is like, okay, if I'm running an organization like CARE, let me evaluate my own organization, part of which would be the programs. The other part of the organization would be, different factors within a business component, like financial accountability, human resource, effectiveness of perhaps a board, so there's a whole bunch of things that go into that as well. What we're interested in as an ICT4D project class is on the program or project level. So this is what we will be using the Wikipedia case for. So with this context, let's go into program level. What are you trying to evaluate? Most of the time, we're looking at measuring the program or project effectiveness to see if it meets its objectives. Right? And there's a lot of types that I'm not going to go into simply because we don't have the bandwidth for that in a class of a nature like this. But there's a whole bunch of types, and people debate it to death about like what do I do in what particular situation. Very much similar to research in PhD projects or whatever. What is a good research methodology? This is usually the major purpose that people cite for doing an evaluation. But as we've mentioned, right, in international development, sometimes the technical side of things is not necessarily what is the whole truth. There's a lot of times you would want to do evaluation to comply with certain donor requirements, like, okay, I'm just going to do an evaluation because, it's built into the project and I'm not going to get funded if not. Some kind of legitimacy, people are saying we're not doing well, so let's, try to do an evaluation and make ourselves look better. Certification, lessons learned. So there's a whole bunch of reasons. Sometimes it's really just to kill a project. It's like, I don't think this project is working, but people, the donor is still insisting, or my constituents are still insisting that me as a donor pay them. I'm just going to do an evaluation and see how bad it is. So there's a whole bunch of other reasons, just know that. And the reason for that is when you actually get hired to do an M&E, you got to know these reasons. You don't go in there and just say, okay, fine, I am this academic person and here are the 5 methodologies I'm going to do, because you got to be really aware of all these political contexts to be able to kind of mitigate all that peanut butter that falls in and not kind of be used as just not do something that your client doesn't want. So sometimes, I do this a lot, when is an evaluation worth doing, right? Because there's an assumption that in every project, evaluation is a must. But that's not true. Sometimes it's too small a project. Sometimes, it depends on who wants this. If somebody in the organization wants this, sometimes it might not be as worth it to spend the money as much as it might be for the donors. Sometimes it is about resources. For example, when I was running a project in Africa, it was an access to justice project. The entire project in itself was $100,000 per year, but the evaluation itself with IPA, the folks that are doing these Mercedes-Benz of the evaluation, that would be $250,000. So that doesn't justify the cost benefits. Is that political support? Sometimes, you want to do an evaluation, but then there's no buy-in. Nobody wants that project to be evaluated for whatever reason, because, they're going to find out that I've been embezzling money, or, they're going to close some avenues for me. So having said that, right, once we go through this process and we decide, okay, yeah, it's still worth it, actually, this slide pack, it brings back memories, because this was a class I taught in grad school. So because I was like, I'm so stretched on time, I just dumped the slides in there. But this is like, almost, 15 years ago when I was teaching this at UW. Okay, so regular components, it's very similar to your needs assessment. I think I mentioned that before. You come up with, contextual information, purpose, and objectives. You come up with your indicators design, and then how do you collect your data, and then come up with a set of problems. This sounds familiar, right? Sounds like the needs assessment, and one of the things that we use as a framework for the needs assessment to plunk this into a logical sense is the logical framework. So. A lot of times within evaluation, there's academic and then there's the manager, right? The academic goes in there and they go, okay, fine, this is a very, very streamlined, neat process. Unfortunately, a lot of times you get to see your stakeholders, and as an evaluator, you're kind of managing all those reactions, because a lot of times you're getting some facts that top management might not want to know, even though your middle management might want to know, or your donors might want to know, but your stakeholders might not, your beneficiaries might not want to tell you. So knowing that kind of political context, and this is part of a stakeholder mapping type exercise that you can do at any stage of the project. Okay, so a range of indicators. Don't worry about the yellow. That was a case that we were doing before. But it could range from, this is sort of like the types of indicators, right? It could just be a gut feeling. Once upon a time it was like that. Do you think the project was working well? Yeah, it looks fairly fine. These women seem to be finding our program useful. The input side of things, which is the lower level, what are the inputs we're putting in terms of the resources, the number of staff, number of workshops, for example, process, outcomes level, on the level of efficiency and productivity. Sometimes you talk about the span and scope, how broad or how deep, satisfaction level, and as we move along, especially with the Millennium Development Goal, and as the field starts to mature, we're talking more about impact. How does this project go beyond its mere project outcome and actually achieve some kind of societal impact? So you can see that, there's a range from kind of subjective to objective, and it's all over the map. So when you're coming up with a design, one of the things you would want to do as an evaluator is to go back to, okay, what are the purposes of evaluating, and what are the best design, what are the best designs that are most appropriate? And then, of course, that's validity and reliability. I'm not going to go into that, but that's a standard type of research methodology to make sure that your results are valid and reliable. And within M&E, there are ways to do things like that, like, for example, getting a baseline, having a control group, triangulation of data and things like that. I guess one of the interesting things about the research design is that there's oftentimes when I've run projects and I've gotten, when I've hired evaluators to come in, what they would usually do is they would say, well, here's my standard methodology that I use to do any kind of ICTD or health type of research design. But a lot of times you find that those are just templates without knowing all the nuances and the problem that the best consultants and the best evaluators are the ones that are actually cognizant of what exactly is the problem. Sometimes your client will say, well, I think the problem is, information. I need to give, for example, SMS to these health folks and to remind them to take their medicine. And they think that is something that needs to be evaluated, because they think that might be either a project goal or that might be a challenge in the design, and most evaluators will come in and take that for face value. But with experience, you will realize that you need to ask a little bit more question and get more data to make sure that, again, as you're mapping all these, the stakeholder mappings and their purposes, that you get a sense about what exactly is the purpose and what exactly are they trying to address, what is the problem, and what are the questions. So, and this is the part that is very, very, very common in practice, the academic versus the managerial. And it's not either or, it's not a black or white thing, it's actually a spectrum, right? What happens is that when we have hired, say, researchers or PhD or professors from sometimes a lot are social science professors that do this for a living, and then they do evaluation. You find that, wow, it's really, really precise. It's very slow. It takes like longitudinal studies over 3 years, and as a manager, sometimes you are like, no, I can't do that. I just need the data right now. It's a very scientific-based method with quantitative, qualitative, and very clear design, clear objectives, very careful study. Everything is written, precise, and your standards are very academic. Then, of course, in reality, what happens to the manager is, well, you know what? I'm doing this because I need to decide yesterday, right? And there's so many things that are happening. I don't have time to do a 3-year design. The objectives are competing. I need to focus on action. I don't need a study. In fact, if you could just give me bullet points, a lot of times I'm like telling my evaluators, don't write me anything that's 100 pages because I don't have time to read it. Just give me bullet points. Verbal communication, a lot of times I'm just calling them and saying, you know what, I need to either do this workshop or not. What do you think? Data is not complete, and you hardly have any kind of a review. Okay, there's a lot of design types, and like I said, a class like an M&E class is as much as a research methodology class. Similar in nature to sort of, if you're a PhD student, you'll be taking these research type classes. We don't need to go into this except for you to know that, there's a lot of design methodology out there. Once again, they range, right, from the whole very, very academic style. Like in the M&E world, I think, have you heard of IPA and the randomized controlled trials, right, like the RCTs? Right, that's considered this really, really careful study with very good control groups and making sure that you actually get a sample that is reliable. And then, of course, on the other end of the spectrum, it's like, I don't have time or the resources to perform this evaluation, but we just need to make a decision. So let's just go in there for half a day, observe, and then write out a report. So knowing that, just know that there's a whole bunch of design types. This is just the study behind it. At the end of the day, you still need to pick what is appropriate for the design. So having said that, here are some of the more common methods that you would hear in the literature, right? And each of these, like I said, could be a class in itself. Balanced scorecards, which is it borrowed from the business side of things. Cost benefit, benchmarking, best practices. At some point there was a lot of rapid assessment tools that you can just go in and do a quick and dirty type of study. Okay. Then, once we move from methodologies, the next phase we would go to is, okay, once we decide what indicators we're measuring, how we're going to get the data, what data we need, the next thing we need to do is how we're going to collect it. And you can see that, the yellows basically say less obtrusive to more obtrusive. So how do you get the data and what... Well, I remember once upon a time my slide pack was blue, and I went back, I'm like, why did I ever use a blue background slide pack? Okay, so you can see that it's less obtrusive to more intrusive. So what are some of the things you can do, right? You can do a statistical analysis, right? That's just reviewing of data. You don't even talk to any of the beneficiaries. Right, simulations, content analysis, and then you go all the way down to, surveys, group observations, surveys, testings, personal interviews, participation, observation, and really in-depth case studies. And in this day and time, sometimes case studies are also called stories. So that's a data collection method. So with that as a, 10-minute summary of, an entire M&E course, right? I would love some questions, and then let's go into the exercise for Wikipedia. Any questions on this? As a broad, big picture type M&E?
Do you know what a ballpark percentage of a reasonable M&E budget would be? I know it must range dramatically, but...
Yeah, well, it used to be that when you write a project proposal, people actually don't even have a budget line for M&E. I think in this particular case, monitoring and evaluation should be maybe about 7 to 10% of the budget. And then I think if it is a complex, like sometimes if it's a pilot that you need a lot more monitoring, then you might increase that to about 15%, but probably not more than that, unless you are IPA, in which case they'll be like, okay, this is going to be the Mercedes-Benz side of things. But good question, yeah. Any other questions on M&E? Okay, if not, then why don't we look at the Wikipedia case? Did you read it? I thought it was fairly informative and interesting. Did you get a chance to read? This is Wikipedia in 2006. And do you remember in 2006 they had that they had an evaluation, right? Because one of the things that they were talking about is they were being attacked on quality of the articles, and so after that they had an evaluation that actually had people go through thousands of articles and compared it to the traditional encyclopedia. Do you remember that? What I'm talking about? Right? And then do you remember what the results were?
It was marginally, a tiny bit more accurate than Encyclopedia Britannica, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
Something like that, yeah.
Mistakes in the encyclopedia and like 4 mistakes.
Something like that, right? So that was one way they were evaluating post this case, where they said, well, okay, it's the quality of cases. So think about that, right? A lot of projects start like this, particularly ICT projects. You start it with one particular purpose in mind, and then it morphs and grows organically into something like this. Same with Amazon. I mean, Amazon is not an ICT-D project, but a lot of these startups morphed into something else altogether. So then, if you were doing something like this and you backtrack and you go, okay, well, is it really successful if, if the number of articles are really high? Is it successful if it has fewer mistakes than the traditional encyclopedia? Is it successful because I have so many people working more on this thing, or is it less? So, and this is something that is common, especially in an ICT project. They come to you and they say, I don't know what I'm doing anymore. I don't even know what success is. So, given that, what I thought we would do is just design this, in teams and come up with what are some of the indicators, the data, types of data needed, and the data collection. So these were the things that we talked about in the slide pack, right? What are some of the measurable indicators? What types of data you need, and what is the data collection? And do you remember this framework? I mean, this is the logical framework that we also use for needs assessment, except that I just kept it simple. I do not understand the thing that goes below the objectives, the activities and inputs and things like that. Okay, so with that in mind, tell me about Wikipedia. What would you formulate as sort of an overriding type of goal? Let's start with the overriding goal and then let's split into, or you know what, even let's backtrack. One of the interesting things about Wikipedia is that it's an open source project, and for its time, it was really sort of the poster child of open source and peer-to-peer sort of review, etc. Tell me a little bit about open source projects. What are they? And why is that? How has it become like what they're saying? It's disruptive, it's a new model, it's never been done before, so we don't know what to do with this. What is open source and why was it such a big deal? Seema?
Mostly when people write software, the code is usually tied in by licenses because you buy the software, so the software code is essential to you running the software. What the open source model does is opens up the source code, so the source code is available for anyone to download or edit under the license. What is also special about open source projects is that most of their projects are available online and the repository is available online. So they can add you as a contributor and you can edit and add features to that product. So Wikipedia is an example of open source content. So anybody can go and add edits and then goes through a process of moderation, and once that's over, your edits get added to the thing. But similar to Wikipedia, you have also software code which you can openly edit And
Yeah, and the wiki is open source, right?
Yeah.
So did you guys get that? Did everybody get that? What is open source? Open source simply it's sort of a loose word that says, okay, anyone can add to this, right? And in this particular case, the open source is on the software level, the application level, i.e. you can come in and tweak the actual back-end wiki itself. And it is also open source in terms of content. So even when someone is talking about open source, open data, open everything, you got to get clear about what levels, because some things that are open content might not necessarily be open source on a software side of things. So in Wikipedia's case, it's both.
What's the difference between open source and open data? Like open data is referring to like literally the data being available and self-accessible, right?
Yeah, well, let's ask the iSchool students. What have you learned about open data and open source?
Yeah, you're into it.
Which also reminds me.
Data freely available for anybody to do analysis on, similar to being able for anybody to do analysis on a program by editing it, in a sense.
Let's just say that.
Yeah, it does.
The difference is the tool is source and data.
Yes, which also reminds me, CD, they would be great people to ask about the 206 class on the computer applications, which apparently is pretty exclusive to MIM students.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I think none of us are taking it because we were exempted.
Oh, okay. It's actually fairly useful, I think. It's very, very geeky, but geeky from a layman's point of view. So how do you program? How do you do things like that? Okay, any other questions? Okay, then tell me a bit about what was Wales' initial idea for Wikipedia, and how did it morph into the way that it was? Just some kind of a historical thing from the case. Did he set out to do
He was
a
looking at the Linus model of thinking the more eyes you have on a problem, then the least
bugs?
the least bugs. And so the idea was that the more accurate your article would be, the more people that can actually update it.
Right.
Based on the collective hive mind's intelligence.
And how was it different before it became sort of open like this? How did it start?
Nupedia.
Nupedia, yeah. And how's the model different? And why did it morph?
They were just trying to get experts to collaborate.
Yep.
So it was really restrictive on who could edit.
So that's sort of open in a, I guess, semi-open way, right? It's almost like, okay, you only want you want the academic peer review. That's one extreme. He's looking at the expert model. And then at some point, he just kind of got frustrated because people are not responding. And he's like, okay, whatever. Let's just see what happens. So organically grew into this thing. Why would anyone do this? I mean, why would anyone in their right mind actually go into an open source project? They don't get paid, they spend a lot of time, people argue with you about, your data, they delete it. Why would anyone be interested in open source?
Geeks love it.
Why? Yeah, that's what are the intrinsic values that we get out of it?
Sorry, I didn't mean that as an insult. I don't think that's specific. So my husband is an open stack programmer. So
Don't you know geeks is the new black, right? I mean, we're all cool now.
I consider myself a big geek, even though I'm not the best at technology. But he is most interested in his OpenStack project, even though that's not really what he gets paid for, because he thinks that's how you do it right, and he wants to do it right. And so he's
Yeah.
really interested in
It's interesting. There are a lot of books that talk about the open source culture, and from a geek's perspective, and why someone would actually go into a repository and actually either contribute to something or start something. And if you read it enough, you get this sense that it's an ecosystem by itself with its own culture, its own rules. How you get respect, and usually that's what is one of the intrinsic values. You get the recognition, you get the respect. That, okay, somebody did this. So, it's weird. I mean, I've never been one that is open source. Maybe I'm just too old school, because I like control too much. But I could see, I mean, like reading those books and things like that, I could see why, when you find a sort of a parameter that you can control, right? Most of us kind of look for control, and you could actually go deep into it and get recognition for it, that might be some kind of a reward for doing this. And a lot of people do this out of, as a hobby, most times during work. So, okay, so tell me about the goal. Like, what if you were to, let's start with the overriding goal for Wikipedia, and then we can split into groups and and you can come up with the rest of the frameworks. How would you tell Jim Wales about, what is Wikipedia in retroactive trying to do from a social perspective?
Make information free to everyone.
Okay, overall objective, right? So how would you formulate it? Information for everyone?
Democratize information.
Information for all, right? Democratization of information. Anything else?
Quality information on subjects that people want instead of subjects that experts think people should.
Okay. Quality of information, right? That's another one. And then subjects that people want and need, right? This sounds very much like development projects, isn't it? Like top down versus bottom up. What else?
I think one part was that it really aimed to be much more responsive, not just subjects that people want and need, but newer subjects. Like, you don't have to wait for the next edition.
Okay, so you want speed and accuracy, speed and accuracy, right? Versus the traditional model of having the next edition to come out. Yeah. What other?
Is having information from different sources going to the quality of the information?
Okay, yeah, we could put that quality of information, different sources, right? Some kind of a review system, some kind of a a new type of review system.
And access to just information that previously wasn't published.
Okay, so information for all and access to maybe access to all information, right? Some kind of a transparency goal. Anything else?
I think also transparency in terms of the primary sources.
Uh-huh.
So the interlinking, I think is definitely part of it. So in an encyclopedia, you might not see where all the information comes from.
Okay, so your references,
The hyperlinking.
right? References are transparent too. Transparent and accessible. Okay. Yeah, great. Anything else? And to be honest, I don't know the answer. I mean, I'm just reading the kids. I'm like, yeah, actually, if I'm going to frame this, I wouldn't know what to do with that. Yeah. Okay. What else?
So related to the previous two, the idea that you get a representative of multiple viewpoints, and also you know which viewpoints you're seeing.
Related to.
The last two on the list. So access to all information. I think was talking a bit about from sources that might be repressed, viewpoints that might otherwise be repressed.
Okay, so how would you frame that? Is it voices for all, or avenues for expression, or
I don't know, maybe it's already something.
no? Let's just try to articulate it, because oftentimes, when you're doing an M&E, you're like, okay, yeah, what are we? What do we think is the objectives, right? What would that be? I know what you're saying, it's like references are transparent and accessible, and it's sort of a new type of vocabulary, right? What would you say, like peer review, or voices for the oppressed?
Yeah, it's almost the opposite of peer review because it's the idea that you can get in there even if the normal, more powerful forces.
Right, so it's something like democratization of information, right? So let's just say, okay, voices for all, for one of a better vocabulary. I think we should start drilling down. Okay, one or two more, and then let's start our exercise.
Can you tell us what to do in the exercise again?
Sorry?
Can you repeat what we are supposed to do in the exercise again?
You want to see what we're supposed to do for the exercise?
Yeah.
Right there.
Okay.
So basically, I'm asking, like, what might this look like, right? What is the overriding goal? And one of the things I want to illustrate is that even coming up with an overriding goal is a challenge because and I'm hoping that the groups will actually come up with different goals, right? If this is an overall objective, which is the overall objective and which is the objectives? And that's something that we will do some internal discussions within group. What about, do you think that, are there any objectives concerning, the volunteers, the people? Is it to give people a warm, fuzzy feeling? I don't know. I mean, is that a objective?
Community building.
Community building, maybe, okay. And then do you think there might be any goals, objectives, or however we want to call it, surrounding technology? I mean, do you think that they want, like, to come up with the best kind of platform for sharing? Would that be part of the goal? Are there any technological goals? Yes, maybe? Yeah, come up with the best wiki or something like that. Okay, so with that in mind, why don't we split into two groups? And what I would love for you to do is to design a methodology to measure Wikipedia in 2006. How should we do that? Should we split it right in the middle? So 4-4. Yeah, and then maybe let's spend 20 minutes to formulate this, and then we can discuss it together. Does that work? Okay.